Can you give us the lowdown on the equator issue? Why is MS more common in countries the farther you get away from the equator?
This is less true today than it was in the 60s because of this thing called the airplane. So nowadays, people move around. You know, like for example, a young woman from Ohio may move to Wales, right? Um, and pre-airplane travel, if you lived in Wales, you're probably going to die in Wales. And if you lived in Ohio, you're probably going to die in Ohio, and you didn't like move all over the world. So pre-ubiquitous airplane travel, we noticed that the incidence of MS seemed to be linked to the distance from the equator. And in the 60s, there was like no MS in Africa, like on the equator. And there was a lot of MS in Finland and Sweden and Norway. And what we found was the farther away from the equator you went, the higher incidence of MS. And one of the theories as to why has to deal with exposure to vitamin D. So we make vitamin D when the sun hits our skin, there's a chemical reaction. And low levels of vitamin D pre-puberty increase risk for MS. So if you live on the equator and you're a bronzed god because you've lived your whole life in the sun, your vitamin D is probably elevated compared to if you're a pasty white person who lives in like northern Denmark, right? Because of the exposure to the sun. And it turns out that low levels of vitamin D pre-puberty increase risk for MS. So that's the prevailing theory. There's other theories that deal with cleanliness. And so the more sterile or clean a society, the more autoimmunity we see. And the theory is if you live in an area of the world where hygiene is lower, then you're exposed to bugs and viruses and bacteria more frequently as an infant, and you build a more robust immune response as a result, like a healthier immune response compared to if you sneeze and the nanny scrubs you down in Purell, you know, you touch something and then they sterilize your hand and put it in a glove. We live in these near sterile environments in some Western countries. And so another theory is as you move away from the equator, to speak in gross generalities, you go from developing countries to developed countries with higher hygiene rates. And so maybe you see an increase in MS because of that. Thirdly, if you look at the distribution of genetics, people share genes. And so a population of people, and I keep using Denmark as an example, shares genes and they have genes which increase their risk for autoimmunity compared to populations in like sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a lot of different reasons why we see this distribution. I gave you three theories, but it's becoming less relevant as people move around.